Hello, Art 1 students. So as you can see, I have my visual pun here. I've worked on this claw, I've worked on this leaf. You've seen the videos for those. I do have my reference image up and ready to go on my computer because now what I want to do is just show you a little bit of getting started on the apple portion of my crab apple so that you can see some different color combinations. So once again, I have a red apple. So I'm definitely going to be using some red colored pencil. I'll get some red orange, maybe even some yellow in some of those highlights, some green in the shadows, because remember red and green are complementary colors. So when I overlap those, they will create a type of brown that uses red in it. So it will be cohesive, but will still create that shadow. I'm also going to use some purple in the shadows, some brown, and I'll have some white in there for some of my more highlight area, and like we've done in some of the other ones, just for softening some of those transitions, especially into those bright highlights. So similarly to how I've done with the leaf and with the claw, I'm going to start with basically drawing where my highlight goes, where my core shadow is, and of course where my reflected light is. Because those are the areas where I'm going to need to make sure that I know to shift my color, shift my value, leave the paper showing, those types of things. So early on in the process, it's really important to have those things labeled sort of, so that you can avoid them if you need to, and so that you know where certain colors are going to be and where they're not going to be. So now, because this is a red apple, I typically would start with my red, knowing that I'm going to be overlapping and mixing other colors into that, but I'm going to start with my red and just start in sort of this area, because when I look at my crab apple, or the visual pun reference image, I see that that is mostly just kind of a solid red. It does get darker into the core shadow, and then really dark down here, and then has some purple in it before you get to the highlights. But this portion throughout here is primarily pretty red. So I'm just going to start. Remember, leaving some of that reflected light. And notice that I'm going to make sure that all of the shading that I do kind of mimics that direction of the apple. I'm not going to shade straight up and down. I'm not going to shade across. I'm curving my lines so that I create sort of more roundness on that apple. So I'm going to curve this way on this side. It'll get a little straighter as I go toward the middle, and then it'll start to curve the other way as I get to the other side of that apple, so that once again, my directional line enforces the volume of my form rather than flattening it. So just going to lay some of this red in there. Notice that I'm not pressing down very hard. It's not going to start out very dark. And I am making sure that I softly transition on either side of this red section. Even though I do know that this side is eventually going to be darker, I still want to make sure that everything I do has a smooth value transition and a smooth color transition, so that if I need to change one of those shifts, I can. Because as I have mentioned before, you can always make a shift more abrupt pretty easily. But if you need to soften one of your shifts between value or color, that is much more difficult. So keeping it soft from the beginning is going to be your best bet. So now I'm more toward the middle of my apple. I'm keeping it very light because I know that the general middle area comes off the page more. So it's going to be lighter. Now this side is going to start to curve the other way. So what I'm going to do is actually just turn my page, because for me it's easier to shade in this direction. The only challenge with turning your page is that then you have to make sure that you are looking at your reference image and working in the correct spaces, because it does become a little more challenging, especially toward the beginning, to make sure that you are doing things correctly when you flip your page. You can also flip your reference image. So for instance, if I need to turn my page upside down to work on a part, I can also turn the reference image on my computer upside down so that it actually matches. You could easily have one slide with it right side up and one slide with it upside down. So it's all about finding out what works best for you and making sure that you can be successful. Now, eventually I am going to have some of these streaks kind of come back into my apple, because, you know, when you look at the skin of an apple, it does have some kind of striations or stripes on it. But for now, again, I'm going to try to keep things pretty smooth, but I'm also not going to stress out if there are certain areas that are not completely smooth. Turning my page again, because I've got some red toward the bottom, sort of under both of those reflected light areas. So even though I know, once again, that this is going to be pretty dark down here, I'm only doing little bits at a time, and then making sure that my transitions are smooth. And making sure that I go along with the direction of that apple, so that once again, all of my shading, my directional line, enforces the roundness of that apple rather than flattening it. So there will be places like how I'm doing on the bottom here, where you don't necessarily go up and down the same way some of your other shading does, but it's still a curved line. It's not a straight across line. And since they're going to be crisscrossing and adding more layers, I know that any directional line that I put down here, as long as I keep it smooth and soft, is eventually going to kind of disappear. So then you can come right up here where there's some of that bright red as well. Once again, making sure that I avoid that highlight area. And that I use my directional line. But that I have a smooth transition towards that highlight area. I'm not going to go super far down with this particular part yet. Eventually everything will come together a little bit more, but towards the beginning of your shading and coloring stages, you want to kind of work as minimally as you can. So remember, this is all just still my first layer with my first color. So each video that I post of working on the apple, I will talk less, give you a little less reminders and feedback, and it will become primarily just visual demonstration of the different shading and coloring steps and techniques. Remember to make sure that you are looking at your reference image constantly, because no matter how familiar you are with your reference, you are not going to be able to get it realistically drawn and shaded without having constant reminder and constant visual of what you are working on. especially when it comes to directional line. You want to make sure that you're looking so you can pay attention to where the directional lines actually go, not where you think they should go. So you'll see here towards the back, I'm going to go ahead and start getting some of those sort of stripes in there because there's not a whole bunch of value, a whole bunch of color on that back section. So I want to make sure I don't do as many layers on this portion as I would on the rest of the apple, because I want this part of the apple to clearly look like it is in front of this part. So this part is going to be less saturated and less detailed, and then this part here will probably be the most saturated, this bottom part. The highlight will obviously be pretty unsaturated because it's going to be primarily white. But then this back portion, even though there's a lot of colors in it, will be less saturated as well, simply so that it does recede a little bit more than sort of the front of the apple. So now my next step is going to be to just I would go back over with my red to deepen some of those red values, maybe erase some of my pencil lines, and then I would go in with my next color. So the exact order in which you shade and color is up to you. There is no real right or wrong, so long as you are paying attention to the shadows and the highlights and the midtones, the color transitions, the value shifts, looking at your reference image, and just kind of really working on getting those colors within the colors as accurate as you can. It is a slow process, especially towards the beginning, because it's very important that you don't make anything too dark or too saturated early on. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to build up those layers. You want the saturation and the value to come through subsequent layers, not just within that first layer that you put on there. If you put too much colored pencil on the paper at first, it's going to be very difficult to achieve the full value range that you need to create depth. So once again, keeping that reflected light there on the outer edge of my apple, working my way up with the first and second sort of layers here of the red. Still not super dark, still not crazy saturated. Paying attention to all those directional lines. So that might be pretty much my first layer and a half of the red portion of the apple. So then the next video that I do, we will look at how to get in some of those other colors, some of those shadows, start to really give some form and volume to that apple.